3,000 years of pharaohs ended not with conquest, but with exhaustion. After Ramesses, the certainty crumbled, sea peoples crashed against the delta, grain quotas failed, temples seized authority from weakened courts north and south pulled apart. Outsiders became kings, Libyans, then Kushites promising restoration. A brief Sate renaissance glittered before Persia swept across the Sinai with unstoppable force. Memphis fell, Thebes surrendered, and the last native ruler fled south. The throne that had endured pyramids, invasions, and centuries of glory now passed to foreign empires. The monuments remained, silent stone witnesses to a world that closed without fanfare. Heat clung to the stones of Pi-Ramesses, long after the sun dipped behind the delta marshes, a thick, breathless warmth that settled over the palaces, barracks, and wine houses of the capital. On nights like this, the river moved slowly, as if reluctant to carry the weight of another season toward the sea. Those who lived along its banks sensed something shifting beneath the surface of their world, though few could name it. Egypt had spent centuries believing itself unshakable. Now, faint cracks began to show, hairline fractures at first, thin as an artisan's chisel mark, but unmistakable to anyone who paid attention. One scribe, returning late from the record hall, paused outside the colonnade and watched the torchlight ripple across the city walls. He could hear the quiet click of insects, the chatter of servants returning from the harbor, and the distant rumble of a brewing storm somewhere beyond the delta. Nothing in this scene suggested fragility. Yet the scribe knew the reports waiting on his desk would tell another story. Grain quotas unmet, patrols delayed, taxes slow to arrive from Upper Egypt. The documents had grown heavier in recent years, thick with excuses and gaps where order once thrived. Egypt had reached the end of a long age of certainty, and few realized how quickly certainty could turn into memory. Far from the capital, temples lined the river like ancient guardians, their painted walls still gleaming in the heat. Priests moved through the cool shadows of their halls, offering incense to statues that had endured dozens of dynasties, but their prayers carried a subtle edge of unease. Fewer barges arrived from the south. Fewer shipments of Nubian gold filled the treasury. Fewer officials from the court visited to demand new monuments or inquire about offerings owed. With each passing month, sanctuaries found themselves holding more authority than expected. It began as a matter of necessity. Someone had to settle disputes, distribute grain, calm frightened villagers. But necessity soon turned into habit, and habit into quiet ambition. The first real sign of change came not from a battlefield or a royal decree, but from a funeral. When the great ruler, who had outlived nearly all his children, finally passed into the West, Egypt stood at a crossroads. He had reigned longer than any before him. His victories were carved across more stone walls than his scribes could count. His statues towered in every major city, but monuments cast long shadows, and beneath those shadows, succession had grown tangled. Princes whispered, generals waited, and factions within the palace began to measure one another with the sharp caution of jackals circling the same carcass. Inside the royal residence, preparations for the burial unfolded with rehearsed precision. Embalmers moved with quiet efficiency, wrapping the body in linen and resin, sealing amulets beneath each layer. Outside, the priests of the great temples debated which omens mattered most. Some pointed to strange patterns along the Nile silt. Others spoke of flickering stars. A few noted that the last flood had risen only modestly, nothing like the generous inundations of earlier decades. But no omen could explain the restlessness spreading through the nobles' chambers. or the competing claims whispered through corridors lined with gold. Across the delta, merchants returning from Canaan and the ports of the Levant carried troubling rumors. Old allies were collapsing. Distant kings had lost their thrones. Entire cities had vanished in fires, whose smoke had blown as far as the Sinai winds. Once busy sea routes now felt perilous, scattered with desperate ships filled with hungry families seeking new homelands. Egypt had always stood apart from such turmoil, protected by deserts, by distance, by the Nile itself. But the merchants spoke of coastlines trembling, of kingdoms crushed by migrations no army could fully predict. Every story made the listeners glance uneasily toward their own shore. In Pi-Ramesses, the new ruler attempted to project calm authority. He moved through the palace with practiced composure, distributing gifts, reaffirming officials in their positions, and reminding the cities of the north that the throne remained unbroken, but the land did not respond as it once had. Tribute arrived late. Governors requested exemptions. The treasury, strained by decades of imperial spending, no longer brimmed with the abundance that earlier rulers had enjoyed. Even the military, proud and disciplined, found itself stretched thin across far-flung garrisons. A single event revealed how deeply things had changed. Workers in one West Bank necropolis, craftsmen assigned to decorate and seal the tombs of nobles, laid down their tools and refused to continue. Their rations had dwindled, and the overseers offered only promises. They were loyal men, trained from youth in their father's craft. But hunger rarely negotiates. When their protest reached the capital, it shocked the officials who remembered a time when laborers would never dare to defy the state. If artisans building tombs chose to stop working, what might others do? The upper classes felt the tremors as well. Landholders sent their sons to the temples at Thebes more often than to the court in the Delta, sensing that the sacred city's authority was rising. Priests oversaw festivals with increased solemnity, yet even they noticed irregularities. Fewer pilgrims arrived from distant nomes. Offerings once carried in boats along the river were reduced to smaller bundles. In some towns, abandoned shrines collected dust as villagers moved closer to fortified estates seeking protection. Such movements had happened before during difficult seasons, but this time they carried the taste of something more permanent. Meanwhile, south of Thebes, the villages along the riverbanks began to shift in their loyalties. The great distance between Upper Egypt and the Delta grew wider in spirit than in geography. People who once admired the strength of the northern court now wondered whether its glory had faded for good. When officials arrived to collect grain or enforce decrees, they were met with polite obedience but less genuine respect. The priests of Amun, seeing an opportunity, expanded their influence quietly. They offered stability, ritual certainty, and food distribution when the state faltered. Behind closed doors, their treasuries accumulated. While these changes unfolded slowly along the Nile, one region felt the transformation more sharply: the delta's outer edges. Fishermen who spent their nights on narrow boats noticed foreign sails more frequently. Some crews were harmless, traders looking for harbors. Others carried desperate families in search of land. Still others came equipped for raiding, probing Egypt's coastal villages with unsettling persistence. These encounters remained small skirmishes, easy enough to dismiss, but the frequency alone suggested that the wider Mediterranean world was convulsing. Within the royal palace, tension thickened. Princes who had once deferred to one another out of tradition now pressed quietly for influence. Advisors wrestled over which policies mattered most. securing the north, reinforcing the southern temples, or repairing old alliances abroad. Every argument seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. Egypt no longer had the strength to do all three. Choices had to be made, and choices carried consequences. In this atmosphere, the death of the aging monarch became more than a royal passing. It marked the end of a long-standing equilibrium, a delicate balance between court and temple, throne and river, crown and people. Once broken, that balance proved difficult to restore. The new reign began with optimism, but beneath its early proclamations lay an unspoken truth. Egypt had stepped into an unfamiliar age, one in which its vast bureaucracy no longer responded with the efficiency of earlier centuries. Still, many along the Nile clung to hope. Farmers planted their fields with the same faith their forefathers had held for generations. Children recited hymns to the gods at sunrise. Barges moved steadily between towns, carrying produce, pottery, and gossip. Yet even in these daily rhythms, hints of change crept in. Granaries not quite full, festivals less crowded, patrols returning with troubling news from frontier roads. What unsettled Egypt most was not an immediate disaster, but the dawning realization that decline could begin quietly. It did not always roar like a storm. Sometimes it drifted in like a faint breeze, emptying storehouses grain by grain, eroding loyalty one village at a time, softening the foundations of power until they no longer held the world together as they once had. By the time northern officials noticed that their messages to Thebes returned more slowly, the process was already underway. By the time priests observed that their offerings came from fewer donors, their authority had already shifted. And by the time the royal court realized that the Delta and Upper Egypt were beginning to think of themselves as separate lands again, the old unity had already begun to slip, quietly, steadily, almost imperceptibly. Egypt stood on the threshold of a new era, not yet fully aware of the battles, migrations, and fractures waiting ahead. Its people still believed their world could be repaired. Its rulers still trusted the river to raise itself in time. Yet the forces gathering beyond the horizon cared little for belief or tradition. Pressure mounted from lands collapsing to the north, from shifting loyalties within, and from an economy no longer capable of sustaining an empire's ambitions. The twilight of the new kingdom had begun, not with a conquest, not with a disaster, but with a soft, steady unraveling. And no one, not even the most experienced scribe in Pyrameses, could yet see how far the unraveling would go. Dry winds swept across the northern frontier, long before anyone realized they carried more than dust. They arrived with an unusual sharpness, blowing from lands where whole kingdoms had stopped sending envoys, where harbors once filled with merchant sails now lay silent. Traders approaching the delta noticed abandoned ports along the Levantine coast, scorched storehouses and villages where every door stood open as if the owners had fled in a single night. These signs traveled faster than ships themselves, whispered by sailors who had seen too much on their routes home. When they reached Egypt, the rumors fell like stray sparks on dry grain. Along the Nile, ordinary life continued for a time, though with an uneasy rhythm. Farmers planted seed as they always had, marking the river's retreat with seasoned eyes. Yet many hesitated before cutting into the soil, glancing toward the horizon as if expecting the earth to shift beneath them. Stories from abroad clung to their thoughts. Whole families were said to be wandering through Canaan. Mountain peoples drifted toward distant shorelines. Caravans had vanished somewhere beyond the Sinai. No one knew the full extent of the upheaval, but everyone sensed its scale. In the delta marshes, the first encounters happened quietly. a small fishing hamlet along an eastern inlet, spotted unfamiliar boats drifting near the reeds. The vessels did not carry sails recognizable to anyone there, nor did the men aboard speak a language the villagers understood. At first, they seemed weary migrants, their children wrapped in patched cloth, their faces drawn. But others followed behind them, larger crews with shields strapped to the hulls, moving with intention rather than desperation. When these ships tested the shoreline, the villagers fled inland and alerted the nearest garrison. The local commander rode out with a handful of chariot teams. He found the attackers probing for weaknesses, their movements practiced, their weapons polished. The skirmish that followed did not last long. The raiders retreated quickly, vanishing into the inlets as if testing Egypt's readiness rather than attempting a true assault. Still, the confrontation left the commander troubled. These were not the petty pirates of earlier decades. These were soldiers accustomed to movement, groups who had learned to travel with their families, belongings, and ambitions all at once. While these first signs reached the delta towns, inland communities were facing trials of their own. A season of low floods had left grain supplies slim, and the next inundation offered little reassurance. In distant years, the failure of floodwaters meant hardship, but the state usually compensated by drawing on its reserves or redirecting shipments from more fortunate nomes. This time, the networks that sustained such relief had frayed. Grain caravans moved slowly. Bureaucrats delayed decisions. Temples in Upper Egypt often dispatched their own stores to support their districts, yet each month strained them further. Amid these shortages, something more unusual emerged. Villagers abandoning temples, not out of defiance or neglect, but because survival demanded it. People needed hands in the fields, not priests chanting through half-empty shrines. Rituals shortened, offerings dwindled. In many towns, the statues of ancient gods watched from dim sanctuaries, while daily life shifted outside, where hunger pressed harder than devotion. Though the departures carried no rebellion, they signaled a deep change. Faith remained, but the institutions representing it no longer held the same authority. Labor unrest followed shortly after. In one village near Thebes, where artisans carved funerary stelae and painted tomb scenes for minor nobles, the workers realized that their rations could no longer sustain their families. They approached their overseer respectfully, reminding him that their work honored the great lords of the two lands. The overseer agreed, but offered no solution beyond patience. When days passed without improvement, the workers quietly stepped away from their tasks. Murmurs spread along the valley. If artisans could stop, what else might falter? The sense of unraveling accelerated when soldiers in the delta went unpaid. Veterans stationed near the coastal fortresses felt the strain most sharply. Letters reached pyramesses, complaining of empty ration jars, damaged equipment, and the lack of reinforcements. Some units resorted to hunting along the marsh edges, or bargaining with local farmers for food. Commanders did what they could, but even they recognized the greater danger. A hungry army is an uncertain one. Loyalty, though strong, cannot feed a family. While internal pressures mounted, the movements beyond Egypt's borders grew larger. What began as scattered migrant groups soon turned into waves. People uprooted by famine, war, or unknown catastrophes drifted toward the Mediterranean's most stable land. They approached Egypt like a river running backward, first quietly, then surging. Caravans from the north reported entire stretches of road empty of merchants. Once thriving towns in Syria and the old Hittite lands had emptied, leaving only charred beams and broken pottery. Some said earthquakes had struck. Others swore foreign armies had burned everything in their path. No explanation remained consistent, but all agreed on the result. The world beyond Egypt was collapsing in ways no one fully understood. Inside the royal court, these accounts demanded urgent attention. Advisors urged the ruler to act decisively, to fortify the delta, to secure grain, to reinforce alliances that had not yet broken. Others counseled patience, convinced that Egypt had weathered storms before. Yet even the most optimistic knew this situation differed from previous threats. Foreign turmoil had always existed, but rarely had it pressed so insistently against Egypt's borders. The temples, meanwhile, sensed opportunity in the uncertainty. High priests, especially those in Thebes, offered stability through ritual, distribution, and moral authority. They framed the chaos as a sign that the temples must guide the land, while the court struggled. Many villagers agreed. When faced with hunger or fear, people often turned toward those who promised order. Slowly, the balance of influence tilted. At the same time, conversations in the delta began drifting toward a troubling idea: that the north and south were becoming distinct lands again. Older farmers shook their heads at such talk, remembering stories of Narmer's unification and praising the two lands as inseparable. But even they could not ignore the practical divides forming. Taxes collected in the north rarely reached the south. Military messengers traveled slowly between cities. Local governors began acting with increased independence. The distance between the two lands no longer required miles. It grew in the space between expectations. As for the throne, every decision seemed to carry consequences. If the ruler directed all resources to defending the delta, internal regions would suffer. If attention shifted southward to safeguard Thebes and its temples, the coast would loosen like an unguarded rope. And if diplomacy with foreign neighbors became the priority, the domestic unrest could widen. There was no path that did not demand sacrifice. Despite this looming uncertainty, daily life along the Nile retained flickers of normalcy. Markets still opened with the sunrise, and fishermen cast nets from reeds or small wooden boats. Children played beside the river, untroubled by distant migrations. Scribes continued their record-keeping, though their ledgers grew sparse. To many, the world still felt familiar enough that hope remained strong. They believed the Nile would rise again, trade would resume, and the raiders testing the coast would disappear as quickly as they had arrived. But every year made that belief more fragile. Entire families traveling from the Levant began appearing near Egypt's frontier towns, exhausted and sunburned. Begging for safe passage, patrol commanders reported that some groups carried weapons not for invasion, but for survival. Others arrived with ox-drawn carts bearing children and woven goods, remnants of their ruined homes. These migrants were the human echoes of collapsing kingdoms, walking evidence that the Mediterranean structure was breaking. Eventually, these migrations turned violent, not by design, but by desperation. A few groups attempted to seize farmland near the delta. Believing it unclaimed, others tried to raid storage houses along the river. Egypt repelled these attempts, but each confrontation strained the state further. Maintaining order required food, troops, rebuilding, and diplomacy, all at a moment when Egypt had less to spare than ever before. Meanwhile, the palace faced another unexpected challenge. Images of divine kingship no longer matched reality. Egypt had long believed that its rulers held a sacred role, maintaining order between the world and chaos. But when soldiers went unpaid and grain shipments faltered, the kingdom's spiritual narrative suffered. Priests began performing rituals with greater urgency. hoping to balance cosmic order as human institutions weakened. They sensed that Egypt's very identity was being tested. As whispers of decline reached deeper into the Nile Valley, the most perceptive officials recognized a pattern. Egypt was not facing a single catastrophe. It was facing many at once: environmental stress, international collapse, internal fragmentation, and an influx of uprooted peoples. Any one of these could have challenged an empire. Combined, they formed a pressure that even Egypt's long resilience might not withstand. By the time the next flood season failed again, leaving silt thin and fields brittle, the truth became impossible to deny. Egypt stood on the edge of a new age, defined not by expansion, but by endurance. The world beyond its borders had turned hostile, not out of malice, but out of its own desperate transformations. And as the first full wave of seaborne invaders approached the delta, bringing warriors, families, ox carts, and memories of destroyed homelands, the kingdom realized that the smoke rising on distant horizons was not distant at all. It was the beginning of the storm that would redefine the fate of the two lands. Morning haze drifted across the delta canals when the first messenger rode into Pyrameses, with news no official wanted to hear. He arrived breathless, mud clinging to his sandals, the reins of his horse slick with sweat. The guards recognized urgency in his voice before he even spoke. Something had happened along the northern approaches, something larger than the scattered raids of past seasons. As the messenger was escorted through the palace gates, servants paused in their duties, sensing the tension that settled over the courtyard like a shadow. Inside, the council hall stirred to life. Scribes unrolled fresh papyrus sheets. Commanders adjusted their belts, and the ruler sat rigid, waiting for the report. The messenger bowed, then delivered the words that seemed to shift the temperature of the room. Entire settlements along the Mediterranean coast had fallen silent. Villages that once offered shelter to merchants now stood empty. Smoke marks scarred the fields. And near the coast, foreign encampments grew by the day. Families, warriors, and herds moving together in a mass that stretched far beyond anything Egypt had ever seen. What troubled the council was not merely the size of these migrating groups, but the pattern behind them. They were not a single people. They were many, traveling together out of necessity rather than alliance, drawn forward by the collapse of lands Egypt once traded with. The world beyond the Nile was coming undone, and the fragments were drifting south. Along the Mediterranean shoreline, the earliest witnesses were fishermen. They spotted unfamiliar vessels passing the marsh boundary, boats longer than those used by Levantine traders, their wooden frames patched with whatever materials their owners had salvaged. Some carried woven tents and livestock. Others bore warriors hardened by months on the move. These crews approached cautiously at first, rowing close enough to see the reeds, but avoiding the shallows. Yet each passing day brought more of them, until entire clusters floated offshore, like wandering villages at sea. Far inland, caravans arriving from Sinai spoke of collapsing trade routes, trails once filled with merchants exchanging metals, timber, and spices now hosted lines of refugees. These travelers described burned market squares, abandoned ports, and storms that had battered fleets attempting to flee northward. Earthquakes were rumored to have shaken islands. At times, the sea itself was said to have swallowed coastlines. No story remained consistent, except one. The old order in the Mediterranean had shattered. For Egypt, whose strength depended on predictable rhythms, floodwaters, trade cycles, diplomatic ties, such instability created an invisible pressure that grew heavier each month. Officials noticed the signs first. storehouses less full than expected, foreign tribute arriving late, and coastal patrols requesting assistance more frequently. Grain that once traveled easily from Upper Egypt began to stall along the river, delayed by disputes or shortages. Even the temples, long accustomed to receiving steady offerings, saw their granaries stretched thin. In response, the ruler convened his commanders along the delta frontier. These were seasoned men who had served under strong kings and weathered the tail end of earlier conflicts. Many had grown old on campaigns that secured Egypt's borders from Libyan incursions and desert raiders. Yet none had experience with the kind of movement now stirring beyond the coast. A tide of displaced peoples who carried their worlds with them on wagons and boats. Scouts were dispatched north, assigned to watch the inlets, measure numbers, and judge intentions. Some returned with reports of camps forming along the beaches. Others noted that certain groups attempted to trade, offering pottery or hides in exchange for grain. But mixed among these were bands clearly searching for openings, testing river mouths, probing weakly defended hamlets, and observing Egypt's patrols with unsettling interest. While soldiers monitored the coast, a second concern emerged inland. The land battle, should it come, would not start at the shoreline, but at the settlements closest to the delta's arteries. These small towns, accustomed to predictable threats, now faced uncertainty from multiple directions. Villagers kept watch at night, listening for distant noises across the marshes. Smoke rising over distant reeds could mark a harmless cooking fire, or the arrival of a new wave of strangers. In Pyramesses, preparations began at once. The ruler called for the reinforcement of delta fortresses, the construction of new defensive ditches, and the repair of watchtowers long neglected during calmer years. Artisans hammered bronze fittings for chariots. Blacksmiths shaped arrowheads and spear points. Lumber yards worked without pause to supply poles for defensive barricades. The palace buzzed with energy that bordered on desperation, as though Egypt were racing against a threat still gathering strength beyond sight. Among these efforts, one decision carried particular weight: the fortification of the river mouths. Egypt had survived countless dangers because the Nile acted as a natural shield. Yet now those waters risked becoming an entryway. Naval defenses needed strengthening, and quickly. Shipwrights gathered at the harbors, inspecting vessels for flaws. Crews practiced maneuvers on the river, learning to row in tighter formations, preparing to intercept boats approaching from the open sea. Beyond military readiness, a more human preparation unfolded. Families along the delta began storing grain in clay jars, rather than relying solely on communal granaries. Elders instructed the young on how to read unfamiliar sails. Temples offered extra blessings to fishermen before they cast their nets. Even experienced soldiers looked toward the horizon with a caution they seldom admitted aloud. One evening, a coastal patrol returned with clear evidence of early clashes. Their commander recounted how his men had encountered a group of armed outsiders moving through a desolate inlet. The strangers carried round shields and long blades and advanced in disciplined ranks. Their movements suggested they had fought many battles already. The clash was brief but fierce. After a flurry of blows, the invaders retreated back toward their boats, leaving behind only footprints in the mud. This was not an accident of migration. It was a test. Word of this skirmish spread quickly along the Nile. Markets buzzed with speculation. Priests warned that foreign omens were rising. Farmers eyed the marshes warily. And through it all, the ruler knew that these encounters marked only the beginning. The scattered raids would gather into something far more organized. The coastal families, fleeing north, would merge with hardened war bands. and the pressure from the Mediterranean, already immense, would soon become unstoppable. Yet Egypt would not face the crisis unprepared. Within the palace, the ruler laid out a plan to confront the gathering storm. Chariot regiments were recalled from distant posts, archers trained under strict conditions, measuring distance and accuracy hour by hour. Fortresses along the frontier shifted to a rotation that allowed no gaps in surveillance, and outposts near the delta's narrow roads received new garrisons, their soldiers instructed to hold position until the main army arrived. Still, for all the preparations, one truth remained unavoidable. Egypt now stood opposite a threat unlike any in its long history. These movements sweeping across the Mediterranean were not isolated raids or rival dynasties wrestling for power. They were the final consequences of a collapsing world, cities burning, economies breaking, and displaced populations seeking new ground in waves too large to measure. The first clashes in the delta were merely sparks. The true storm waited offshore, gathering strength with every passing week, and soon the sea peoples would strike with a force that would test Egypt's resilience more fiercely than any enemy it had ever known. At dawn, mist settled along the branching mouths of the river, draping the delta in a pale shroud. Beneath that stillness, thousands of soldiers stood ready, their armor damp with dew, their grips steady on bow, spear, and shield. They had spent nights rehearsing formations along the marsh roads, memorizing the ruler's plan. Everyone knew that the sea itself had carried danger toward them, ships filled with wanderers who had become warriors through hardship, families turned into followers, and leaders hardened by ruin. Yet Egypt was determined not to yield the delta's waterways, the veins through which the kingdom drew its life. The first major assault began before sunrise. The air changed, subtle at first, then unmistakable. A faint thrum of oars carried through the morning fog, followed by rhythmic shouts in an unfamiliar tongue. Watchmen on the riverbank strained to see through the haze. Then the silhouettes appeared, dozens of hulls cutting through the water, each one bristling with armed men. Behind them drifted heavier vessels carrying women, children, livestock, and carts piled high with everything a displaced people could salvage. Egyptian archers tightened their formations along raised embankments. They had trained for weeks, adjusting their range to account for damp winds and shifting currents. Now, as the first enemy ships approached, the signal rang out, a horn blast that echoed through the reeds. Moments later, a rain of arrows streaked down from the banks. The sky seemed to ripple with them, darkening for a breath before plunging toward the invaders' decks. Many of the approaching warriors raised shields, but they had not expected such coordinated fire. Men tumbled backward over the sides. Boats rocked violently. Some rowers broke rhythm in terror, causing their vessels to drift sideways and collide. Instead of pressing forward, the first wave faltered, its momentum severed by precision and discipline. The river, however, offered no rest. More ships followed behind, and their commanders urged them fiercely onward. Some boats managed to push past the initial barrage and close the distance to the banks. Warriors leapt into the shallows, splashing forward with swords raised, trying to find an opening in the Egyptian lines. But as they advanced, spearmen surged from the marsh grasses, forming tight walls that held the shoreline like iron. The clash that followed shook the delta. Bronze met bronze. Shields crushed reeds underfoot, and the shouts of both sides rose like a storm-tide warriors who had survived the disasters of other lands now fought with desperate ferocity, their eyes reflecting exhaustion, grief, and the last hope of finding new soil to claim. But Egypt's defenders, drilled, disciplined, and fighting on familiar ground, matched them stroke for stroke. Yet the river battle was only half the plan. While the shoreline forces engaged the landing parties, Egypt's navy launched from hidden harbors deeper inside the delta. Their boats slid silently from channels cut into the reeds, their crews rowing in perfect unison. These vessels carried archers along their decks and shock troops prepared to board enemy craft. Navigating through narrow waterways demanded skill honed over generations. Every sailor knew the currents and silt patterns inside the delta's labyrinth. They emerged from the side channels at exactly the moment the invading fleet was most vulnerable. Enemy ships, already disordered by arrow fire and collisions, now found themselves flanked. The Egyptians rode straight into the confusion, ramming hulls, seizing decks, and cutting down men caught between oars and shields. The sound of cracking timber spread across the river like thunder. For a moment, chaos ruled the water. Vessels spun wildly, some capsizing as their crews panicked. Warriors tried to leap from one floating platform to another, only to slip and vanish beneath the surface. Boats overturned and spilled entire families into the current. The Nile, gentle on most days, now turned into a churning battlefield. From the riverbank, commanders shouted new orders. More archers stepped forward, their lines rotating to keep constant pressure on the invaders. Every volley struck at ships attempting to regroup. Every shield raised in defense slowed their advance. The invaders had expected resistance, but not this ruthless coordination. Land and river acting as one machine. Through all this, the ruler moved along the bank with calm authority, encouraging troops and directing movements with precise gestures. He knew Egypt was fighting not only against armed foes, but against the collapse spreading across the Mediterranean. If the kingdom faltered now, the delta would be lost, and with it, the strength of the two lands. As the sun climbed higher, the tide of battle turned unmistakably. Egyptian boats began towing captured vessels toward the bank. Marines boarded ship after ship, cutting down anyone who resisted and securing those who surrendered. Close to the shore, spearmen forced the last invading warriors back into the water, their shields forming a solid barrier that nothing could break. Some attackers attempted to retreat, paddling desperately toward the open sea. But the river's flow worked against them. Current and chaos slowed their escape, leaving them exposed to fresh waves of arrows. Boats stalled, drifted, and finally capsized under the weight of casualties. What began as a coordinated assault dissolved into a mass of struggling figures and broken wood. By midday, the battle was all but decided. The delta's channels clogged with debris, splintered timbers, overturned hulls, and fragments of shields that drifted slowly toward the reeds. Egyptian soldiers pulled survivors from the shallows. Families seeking refuge, captives taken in combat, and warriors too wounded to fight on. Some were relocated to fortress zones where they could be monitored. Others were pushed back toward the sea, warned never to return. Victory, however, came at a cost. The shoreline was littered with fallen soldiers, and several outposts reported damage from simultaneous attacks launched inland. But the magnitude of the triumph overshadowed the losses. Egypt had not only repelled a vast migrating force, it had shattered their attempt to carve out a foothold in the delta. Yet even as the land celebrated, those closest to the throne recognized a darker truth. Victory could not restore the world beyond Egypt's borders. It could not reopen collapsed trade routes, rebuild ruined cities, or reverse the great migrations already underway. The treasury bore the weight of supplying armies at full readiness. The temples stretched their stores to feed displaced families. And the bureaucracy, once mighty enough to steady the kingdom through droughts and disputes, now showed signs of strain. In the corridors of Pi Ramesses, Whispers circulated about how much had been spent to hold the frontier. Officials debated ration levels and emergency taxes. Scribes warned that the scribal schools had fewer apprentices. And though Egypt had won this battle, no one believed the threat had passed entirely. More waves might come. More crises might emerge inland. The Mediterranean remained unsettled. Then, as if answering that fear, the palace was shaken by another blow, not from raiders, but from within. The ruler whose leadership had delivered the victory suddenly faced a conspiracy brewing in the royal household. The truth spread quietly. A plot had formed among those closest to him. By the time it was uncovered, he had already been struck, and the court reeled with shock. His death marked the end of Egypt's last great triumph, not because victory had failed, but because the kingdom had spent so many years strained by external threats and internal pressures that even its most accomplished leaders could not secure lasting stability. The Delta was safe for now. The invaders had suffered a devastating defeat, but Egypt emerged from the victory trembling, its strength strained, its unity fragile. The storm had been turned back, yet not dispersed, and the forces that had shaken the Mediterranean would continue reshaping Egypt long after the battle ended. Dust drifted across the courtyards of Pyrameses, long before anyone admitted what it meant. At first, servants blamed the dry season. Courtiers blamed careless workers. Scribes blamed the winds from the east. But the true cause lay deeper. The palace was no longer maintained with the precision it once commanded. Repair orders moved slowly. Payments for stonecutters stalled. Workshops waited for supplies that never arrived. Cracks that once would have been patched within days lingered for months. And in those quiet signs of neglect, Egypt's shifting balance of power revealed itself. The great ruler who had repelled the invaders was gone, and the court felt different without his steadying voice. His successor inherited the throne legally, yet carried far less authority in practice. The bureaucracy, strained by years of upheaval, no longer responded with unified discipline. Messages sent from the capital took longer to reach the southern cities. Temple representatives in Thebes acknowledged decrees politely, but seldom hastened to carry them out. And governors along the Nile, long accustomed to deferring to the throne, began weighing certain orders against their own needs before acting. In the streets of Pyrameses, people whispered that the land had two minds now, one in the Delta and one in Thebes. The thought once sounded absurd. The united two lands had been the foundation of Egyptian identity for over 1,000 years. But in practice, subtle divisions were forming, and those who served in administrative posts recognized the shift most clearly. Requests for supplies were routed through different chains of approval, depending on whether they came from Upper or Lower Egypt. Couriers often crossed paths along the river, each carrying messages that contradicted or complicated one another. Confusion, not rebellion, shaped the interactions, but confusion had its own consequences. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the priesthood of Amun expanded its influence with quiet confidence. They did not seize authority through force. They did not challenge the throne openly. Instead, they filled every vacuum the state left behind. When a local dispute needed settling and no official arrived in time, a priest stepped in. When grain ran short and no shipment came from the north, temple granaries opened their doors. When villagers sought reassurance after another tremor along the desert cliffs, it was the priests who interpreted omens and restored calm. Their ascendancy was not dramatic, it was methodical. Each small act strengthened their position, binding the people of Upper Egypt more tightly to them than to the distant court. Temple lands expanded quietly, as families seeking stability offered parcels in exchange for protection or ritual support. Donations increased, labor agreements shifted, and the wealth gathered around the sacred precincts soon rivaled the resources of many provincial governors. Inside the great temple complex, the high priest presided over daily rites with a confidence that suggested he no longer saw himself merely as a religious figure. The ceremonies honoring the god Amun had grown more elaborate, requiring more attendance, more offerings, and more influence over the surrounding region. Each gesture reinforced the idea that the temples held the divine mandate to guide the land when the throne hesitated. No decree from the north could erase that impression once it took root. The effect rippled outward. Artisans in Thebes began dedicating their work to the temples instead of the palace. Stonecutters carved reliefs showing priests performing tasks once reserved for the king. Even scribes trained in the temple schools learned to frame their teachings with greater emphasis on divine order than royal command. Through these shifts, the very identity of authority quietly changed. In the Delta, the court noticed the shift but lacked the strength to counter it. Treasury accounts revealed the strain of recent wars, and emergency levies failed to replenish what had been lost. With resources thin, the ruler relied increasingly on a small circle of advisors who promised stability. Some favored negotiation with the priesthood. Others insisted on reasserting royal control. The debates grew sharper each month, and the throne, once the undisputed pillar of Egypt, now felt like one voice among many. Outside the halls of power, signs of weakening order multiplied. Tomb robberies increased, especially in the older necropolises near Memphis and Thebes burials that once would have been guarded by multiple layers of administration, now lay vulnerable to desperate men seeking gold or grain. Reports described thieves tunneling into burial chambers or bribing low-ranking officials to access tomb precincts. Each discovery shocked the nobles, who viewed such acts as an assault on the heart of Egyptian tradition. But the truth was simple. Famine and instability had pushed people into choices they never would have considered in more prosperous times. Grain shortages spread uncertainty as well. Fields that should have produced ample harvests yielded less each season. Whether the Nile's cycles had shifted again, or the country's labor force was too strained to maintain irrigation canals, no one could say with certainty. Yet the consequences were unmistakable. Prices rose, markets thinned. Families in outlying villages relied heavily on temples or local leaders rather than the state. Into this fragile landscape stepped a growing number of opportunists. Some were minor warlords in remote districts, gathering bands of followers to enforce their own rules. Others were ambitious officials, using the chaos to elevate their status. A few even claimed divine favor to justify new roles in local governance. Though none openly defied the court, each carved out a measure of autonomy that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The ruler attempted to maintain unity through gestures of royal authority, festivals in the north, diplomatic envoys to the few foreign cities still standing, and occasional visits to southern nomes to reassure them of the throne's presence. But while these performances drew crowds, they couldn't reverse the underlying reality. The court no longer commanded the same automatic obedience. Each region now acted according to its own priorities, aligning with the throne only when it proved convenient. Despite these challenges, the people of the Nile Valley continued their daily routines with quiet persistence. Farmers tended their fields. Fishermen moved along the river. Scribes documented what they could. Egypt's strength had always been its ability to endure hardship, not merely to dominate. Yet beneath the surface, a new kind of fragility settled into the country's foundation. a sense that the old unity might slip away entirely if the coming years pushed the land any further. In that atmosphere of tension, the priesthood made a decisive move. Without confrontation, without fanfare, they assumed responsibility for matters once reserved for the palace, settling regional disputes, coordinating grain storage, and overseeing large-scale temple projects that employed thousands. These actions filled immediate needs, and many welcomed them, but every such step removed another piece of authority from the throne. By the time officials in the Delta recognized how deep the shift had become, the division was no longer hypothetical. It was lived reality. Two spheres of power shaped Egypt now, one rooted in royal ceremony and the memory of centralized rule, the other grounded in ritual authority and the confidence of a region that no longer waited for northern approval. Egypt had not yet split in name, but it had begun to lose its center, and the forces that pulled north and south apart would soon redraw the map of the two lands in ways no one in Pyrameses could yet imagine. Night fell softly over Thebes when the decisive shift finally took hold. Lanterns flickered along the temple walls, casting gold ribbons across sandstone columns, older than the memories of most who walked beneath them. Music from a ritual procession drifted through the avenues, the low beat of drums answering the steady cadence of priests reciting ancient hymns. Nothing in the scene suggested confrontation, yet beneath the ceremonial calm lay a truth that changed the fate of Egypt. The priesthood no longer behaved as custodians. They behaved as rulers. In the inner sanctuary, the high priest reviewed tallies of grain, land holdings, and regional obligations, with an ease that once belonged solely to the palace scribes. These records flowed to Thebes more quickly than to Pyrameses, a fact that astonished even seasoned administrators. Villagers sent reports to the temple before acknowledging the court settlements looked south for arbitration when disputes emerged. And in moments of crisis, whether a failed flood, a caravan robbery, or a collapse in the local canals, it was the temple that acted first. Meanwhile, Pyrameses attempted to maintain the illusion of control. Courtiers continued planning festivals, drafting decrees, and dispatching officials to distant nomes. But the responses that returned felt increasingly diluted, as though the voice of the throne reached the provinces only after echoing through a long corridor of competing authorities. Governors accepted royal orders with polite bows, then consulted the Amun priests before committing to action. Even loyal administrators hesitated to push against the growing influence of Thebes. South of the Delta, the Nile carried subtle signs of these changing loyalties. Barges transporting offerings for the temple complex grew larger each season. Wooden crates filled with incense and grain floated past smaller towns, where villagers watched with quiet acceptance. No one questioned why the shipments to Pyrameses had diminished. They simply acknowledged the different rhythm of authority, a rhythm that beat strongest where the great sanctuary of Amun cast its shadow. A turning point emerged in a single moment, the appointment of a powerful priest to oversee matters usually belonging to the royal court. This decision was never announced formally. It happened through necessity. A dispute in Upper Egypt escalated between two wealthy lineages competing over irrigation rights. No official from the north arrived in time to manage the conflict. Instead, temple representatives intervened, negotiating a settlement that both families accepted. Their choice to obey the priests over the crown sent ripples through every nome along the river. As months passed, similar interventions multiplied. Priests directed work crews to repair canals. They oversaw tax collection in regions suffering shortages. They blessed new construction projects that expanded temple lands. and they began appointing deputies who served simultaneously as spiritual leaders and political overseers. This merging of sacred and administrative power created a structure more stable than what the northern court could offer, and stability was a currency Egypt desperately sought. In the Delta, the royal court attempted to counter this southern ascendancy by reinforcing its political alliances. Nobles received invitations to banquets, where the ruler emphasized unity and the ancient bonds of the two lands' gifts circulated through the highest ranks. Jewelry crafted from Nubian gold, linen robes embroidered with falcon motifs, and ritual items meant to signify royal benevolence. Yet these gestures felt increasingly symbolic. Everyone present could sense the strain beneath the polished veneer. Merchants returning to the capital carried unsettling observations. They spoke of southern towns where temple banners hung higher than royal emblems, and of provincial guards who reported first to Thebes. In some regions, the queen's emissaries were ushered into guest chambers, while temple officials occupied the center of political discussion. When news of this reached Pi-Ramesses, the court grew anxious, but its response came too slowly to reverse the trend. Even the army reflected this imbalance. Troops stationed in Upper Egypt depended increasingly on temple resources for food and water. The priesthood managed caravan networks that moved between dangerous stretches of desert and the Nile's cultivated banks. Their logistical efficiency surpassed what the northern command could provide. Soldiers loyal to the ruler still saluted the throne, yet they found themselves eating from granaries the palace did not control. Over time, such patterns shaped allegiance more deeply than decree. Further instability emerged when northern officials began falling into disputes among themselves. Treasury scribes argued over dwindling revenue. Overseers blamed each other for delayed harvests. Local administrators questioned whether the court's instructions remained practical. Meanwhile, the temple maintained a consistent message. Amun's favor determined Egypt's fate, and only through ritual order could the land avoid further decline. Many found comfort in that certainty. Amid this shift, a quieter transformation was happening in domestic life. Families in Thebes adopted customs that emphasized their connection to the sacred city. Children learned temple songs before courtly ones. Stories of Amun's protection circulated at mealtimes. Women preparing offerings for festivals began weaving symbols of southern identity into their household linens. These cultural expressions traveled north gradually, carried by traders and travelers, until even some delta towns found themselves adopting southern patterns of worship. Yet the throne still held prestige. Rituals involving the royal regalia continued, and the people believed the ruler embodied divine order. But this belief faltered when the court could no longer protect tombs, regulate trade, or ensure the steady movement of grain. Someone had to fill the widening gaps. The temple simply stepped forward. Meanwhile, tensions deepened within the ruling family. Ambitious princes and distant royal cousins argued over which policies could restore stability. Some urged negotiation with Thebes, hoping that cooperation would preserve unity. Others insisted that yielding even a fraction of royal authority would set a dangerous precedent. These disagreements rarely left the palace walls, but they contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty that slowed decision-making at the very moment Egypt needed bold action. Out in the wider land, local strongmen continued asserting dominance in remote regions. Their influence might have fractured Egypt entirely had the temple not provided a counterweight in Upper Egypt. This created an unusual dynamic. A divided land held together, not by the throne, but by the competing pull of two centers of power, each asserting its version of legitimacy. One final sign confirmed what everyone had quietly sensed. During a festival honoring Amun, the high priest presided over a public ceremony, usually reserved for the ruler alone. Crowds gathered in the vast courtyard, expecting the procession to follow tradition. Instead, the priest stepped forward and performed the blessing without hesitation. Gasps rippled through the assembly, but no protest followed. The act was not a declaration of rebellion. It was a simple reflection of present reality. In Upper Egypt, spiritual and political authority had fused, and no one questioned it any longer. With that moment, the division became unmistakable. Thebes was no longer a city waiting for royal guidance. It had become the heart of an autonomous realm, one that cooperated with the Delta only when necessity demanded, not from obligation. Egypt had become two lands again, not through conquest, not through foreign invasion, but through the slow unraveling of central power. And the kingdom, once strong enough to reach across deserts and seas, now found itself struggling to hold its own river within a single identity. Warm winds carried the scent of marsh reeds across the delta when a new presence began to settle into Egypt's political landscape. Quietly at first, almost imperceptibly. Among the soldiers stationed near western outposts, unfamiliar accents started appearing in the barracks. These were men who had once arrived as hired blades, wandering from one conflict to the next along the Mediterranean's fractured coast. Their origins traced back to Libyan clan territories beyond the western deserts, places where water could decide life or death, and alliances shifted with the seasons. Egypt had long relied on them as auxiliary troops, valuing their skill with javelins and their resilience in harsh terrain. But the years of internal strain transformed these mercenaries from temporary guests into permanent fixtures of authority. Many villagers noticed the shift during festivals, when armed escorts accompanied local governors through crowded streets. The escorts no longer consisted entirely of Egyptians tall, broad-shouldered men with braided hair and patterned cloaks marched at their side. They moved with the confidence of those who felt at home. At first, the people assumed their presence was a temporary response to unrest. Yet as seasons passed, their numbers grew, and commanders increasingly relied on them to enforce order. These soldiers understood that Egypt offered stability they had never known in their homelands. And Egypt, weakened by internal divisions, discovered it needed their loyalty more than ever. Across the delta, Libyan families found themselves settling in villages near garrisons. Their children learned to speak Egyptian quickly, playing alongside local youth in the shadow of mud-brick walls. Traders welcomed them into market stalls, exchanging goods without hesitation. Something unusual was unfolding. Outsiders were not merely protecting Egypt, they were becoming part of it. A new layer of society began to emerge, woven from the shared needs of a kingdom struggling to hold itself together. Close to the royal court, however, the relationship carried a sharper edge. High-ranking commanders from Libyan clans proved exceptionally skillful in negotiation, often securing positions that allowed them to manage both military and civilian affairs. Some acquired land as payment for service. Others married into local families, forging bonds that strengthened their hold on regional territories. Their rise was not sudden, nor was it achieved through violence. It developed through opportunity, because Egypt's fractured centers of power created openings, and the newcomers knew how to fill them. Meanwhile, the temple sphere in Thebes observed this growing influence with wary interest. Priests had extended their reach over Upper Egypt with remarkable success, yet the western delta remained firmly tied to the military. The Libyan chiefs stationed there understood the dynamics of local politics. They built trust with villagers, moderated disputes, and protected farmland from encroaching desert tribes. Each act increased their legitimacy. and when the royal court requested their support, they responded promptly, reinforcing their image as loyal servants of the kingdom. Despite this surface cooperation, an undercurrent of tension flowed through the land. Egypt's people could feel it. Two power centers already strained the unity of the two lands, and now a third presence, neither temple nor throne, but something in between, had begun shaping regional identity. In the countryside, stories spread about fierce warriors who defended villages from raiders, then stayed to share meals with the very families they had rescued. Respect became familiarity. Familiarity became trust. Over time, trust gave way to something more profound, influence backed by armed strength. The turning point arrived during the transition into a new dynasty, when the northern court struggled to establish a stable succession. Local officials leaned heavily on the leaders of these Libyan families. They needed soldiers who could respond quickly and decisively. They needed men who could move through desert terrain with confidence. And most of all, they needed individuals whose authority extended beyond the palace walls. In moments when Egyptians hesitated, these newcomers acted. One such leader, calm, strategic, and fully aware of the shifting landscape, began receiving invitations to private councils. He spoke clearly, avoided needless posturing, and understood the delicate nature of royal politics. Over time, his presence in these meetings stopped feeling unusual. He became a trusted figure, someone whose advice carried weight equal to long-established Egyptian nobles. While political circles in Ramesses adjusted to this new reality, southern cities watched from a distance. Thebes continued to strengthen its separate identity, yet even the priesthood recognized the growing influence of Libyan chieftains. They understood that although their authority reached far along the Nile, it did not extend deeply into the western sands. There, the newcomers commanded loyalty, with a force the temples could not easily counter. In many delta towns, the courts began assigning administrative roles to these warriors. They governed districts, supervised tax collection, and oversaw land allocation. Their decisions were not always welcomed by every nomarch or scribe, yet their effectiveness silenced most objections. Egypt's administrative machine functioned only when supported by strong local leadership, and the Libyan families provided precisely that: stability in regions where the old bureaucracy had grown thin. A significant shift occurred when one of these leaders, after years of service and countless victories against roaming desert groups, established himself not merely as a provincial commander, but as a figure whose authority stretched across multiple nomes. Letters addressed to him carried both his Egyptian titles and markers of his ancestral lineage. Such dual identity had never shaped Egyptian governance before, but Egypt itself was no longer the unified state it once had been. Its evolving structure required new kinds of rulers. Meanwhile, the throne's voice grew softer. The court attempted to reassert control by issuing decrees reaffirming royal supremacy, yet few outside Ramesses responded with urgency. Local governors complied in writing, but daily practice aligned with whichever authority stood closest, temple or military. The Libyan chiefs capitalized on this ambiguity. They enforced laws, protected trade routes, and coordinated defense along the western frontier. As long as they maintained order, no one questioned their expanding role. This new dynamic became most visible during a particularly turbulent season, when a series of disputes erupted between rival villages over irrigation rights. Instead of appealing to the palace or the temple, the communities turned to the local Libyan governor. He arrived promptly, mediated the conflict, and restored water distribution with a precision that astonished even veteran officials. His success echoed through the region. Soon, he was asked to manage issues far beyond his immediate jurisdiction. By the time Egypt entered the opening years of the 22nd dynasty, the transformation was complete. A man of Libyan descent, strategic, charismatic, and deeply woven into the fabric of both military and civilian life, stood poised to claim the throne. His ascent was not forced. It was accepted because the land needed a leader capable of bridging the fragmented realities of Upper and Lower Egypt. His early reign brought something Egypt had not experienced in generations: a renewed attempt at unity. Campaigns extended into Canaan. To reclaim old ties, borders were fortified. Administrative reforms spread through the delta, and for a brief time, hope flickered across the kingdom. Hope that Egypt might regain the stability it had lost. But the deeper fracture between temple and palace remained unresolved, and the provincial autonomy cultivated during years of decline continued to spread. The unity this new ruler sought depended on a system already splintering in ways no campaign could fully repair. Egypt now stood in an age shaped not by old bloodlines alone, but by those who had once arrived as outsiders. And their rise signaled a future where identity, authority, and power would continue shifting in ways the ancient order had never imagined. Storm clouds gathered over the western frontier, just as Egypt entered a new phase of uncertainty. Those who traveled between distant nomes sensed it immediately. Roadside shrines left unattended, way stations without guards, tax collectors who no longer knew whether to deliver revenue to the palace, the temples, or the rising Libyan elite. Every route carried the feeling of a kingdom stretched thin, pulled in multiple directions by leaders who shared no common purpose. Not long after the new dynasty took shape, a wave of competing lineages emerged across the delta. Some claimed distant ties to the ruling house. Others leaned on military authority. A handful invoked ancestral rights from Libyan clans that had settled in the region generations earlier. Each lineage controlled a pocket of influence: a trading town, a fortified estate, a cluster of villages near the desert's edge. These domains operated like small kingdoms within a larger one, paying homage to the throne only when it served their interests. Merchants navigating the waterways learned to adjust quickly. A toll paid in one district did not guarantee safe passage through another. Market inspectors in neighboring towns enforced different versions of the same laws. Caravans traveling from the eastern coast to the western delta often carried 3 or 4 sets of documents, knowing that each local chief demanded proof of respect. Such confusion rarely erupted into open conflict, but it created a patchwork of authority that weakened Egypt's ability to act as a single state. Thebes watched this erosion from afar, its temples continuing to exert a steady pull over Upper Egypt. Yet even there, unity proved fragile. Ambitious priests within the Amun hierarchy competed for influence, each seeking control of land and labor. While they avoided public disagreements, their private maneuvering slowed decision-making. During moments that required swift coordination, villages felt the ripple effects. Some looked to the main temple for guidance. Others aligned themselves with powerful priestly families who offered more immediate support. Instead of one spiritual center, Thebes began developing several, each with its own priorities. Amid this growing complexity, Egypt's borders shrank more noticeably than before. Once, armies had marched north into the Levant, establishing outposts that projected Egyptian influence across foreign lands. Now those regions lay beyond reach. The campaigns of earlier centuries had left behind faint memories, but no lasting foothold. Even diplomacy faltered. Messengers dispatched to surviving Levantine cities often returned with little more than rumors. unable to determine which local powers still held authority. As these connections unraveled, Egypt's view of the world narrowed. The kingdom's concerns turned inward, focused more on internal competition than on foreign ambition. To the south, however, another power stirred. The Nubian kingdom beyond the First Cataract watched Egypt's fragmentation with careful interest. At first, their influence appeared only in small gestures, merchants bringing goods traditionally associated with Kushite courts, travelers carrying tales of southern kings who revered Egyptian customs, emissaries hinting at alliances that honored ancient ties. Yet these gestures marked a shift. For generations, Egypt had shaped Nubian culture, sending scribes, artisans, and priests to its cities. Now the cultural flow traveled in both directions, and Nubian authority grew steadily while Egypt's receded. Local governors along the southern river noticed this change before anyone in the delta did. They reported that villages closest to the Nubian frontier grew wealthier, their markets busier than those farther north. Traders from Kush arrived with gold, cattle, and incense, negotiating prices with confidence. Some Egyptian officials began courting their favor, seeking protection or trade advantages. The palace dismissed such reports as exaggerated, but the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Meanwhile, rivalries within Egypt intensified. The ruler attempted to impose structure on the splintering landscape by appointing loyal supporters to oversee key regions. Yet every appointment sparked resentment among those who believed their claims stronger. The result was a delicate web of alliances and silent hostilities. Very few leaders were willing to challenge the throne openly, but many maneuvered to secure local independence. They understood that Egypt was no longer the centralized kingdom of earlier centuries. It had become a mosaic of power centers loosely tied together. In delta towns, the effects were unmistakable. Court officials traveled with larger escorts than before, wary of entering districts beyond their direct jurisdiction. Tax assessments fluctuated wildly from one year to the next, as local leaders decided how much they were willing to contribute. Some offered generous amounts to prove loyalty. Others sent only a fraction, confident that the palace lacked the strength to enforce full collection. These subtle acts reshaped the economic backbone of the kingdom, weakening the court's ability to support large-scale projects or maintain a unified military presence. Even Egypt's cultural memory became contested ground. Monuments from earlier dynasties, once sources of shared pride, took on new significance as different factions invoked them for legitimacy. In the Delta, Libyan descended rulers celebrated the symbols of warrior kings, commissioning reliefs that emphasized strength and victory. In Upper Egypt, the priesthoods highlighted stories of divine lineage, presenting themselves as guardians of sacred continuity. Each group curated history to serve its narrative, emphasizing the parts that strengthened their claim to authority. These competing versions of identity created tension during major festivals. In earlier centuries, celebrations linked the two lands through synchronized rituals, reinforcing unity across distance. Now each region held ceremonies that reflected its own priorities. In Pi-Ramesses, royal processions focused on military power and protection of the northern frontier. In Thebes, festivals emphasized divine renewal and the sacred role of the priesthood. Smaller provinces blended local customs with whichever influence, temple or palace, they found more beneficial. As these variations spread, the idea of a single Egyptian identity blurred. Despite these fractures, daily life across the Nile Valley retained moments of normalcy. Farmers continued tending their fields with familiar rhythms, coaxing crops from soil that had sustained their ancestors for millennia. Potters shaped vessels for markets. Fishermen cast nets at dawn. artisans crafted amulets and household charms meant to protect families from uncertain times. But beneath the surface of routine, an unspoken understanding grew. The structures that had held Egypt together for centuries were dissolving. One final shift made the fragmentation unmistakable. As the new dynasty aged, multiple branches of the ruling family claimed the right to govern different districts. Each branch possessed enough military support to maintain its domain, but not enough to challenge the others. What emerged was a landscape of overlapping monarchs, each with regnal titles, each maintaining courts, each issuing decrees. Their authority extended only as far as their immediate territories, and none could compel the others into submission. This arrangement might have descended into open war, but the land's exhaustion tempered aggression. Leaders recognized that conflict would invite opportunistic raids from desert tribes or encroachment from the south. Instead of fighting, they tolerated one another, creating a delicate equilibrium held together by mutual caution rather than unity. Egypt had survived invasions, droughts, and political upheavals for centuries, but now fragmentation rose from within, not through rebellion, but through gradual shifts in loyalty, identity, and necessity. No single power could claim full authority, and with each passing year, the kingdom drifted farther from the era when Pharaoh's word had shaped the world from the delta to the desert sands. The stage was set for a new force to rise from the south, one that saw opportunity in Egypt's divisions and believed it could restore the land's ancient order, even if that restoration would come from outside the borders of the two lands. Daybreak touched the cliffs around the first cataract with a muted glow, illuminating a landscape that felt older than memory. The river surged with greater force here, threading through granite walls that narrowed its path and filled the air with constant sound. South of these waters, the kingdom of Kush stretched across broad plains and fertile valleys, a land shaped by rhythms distinct from those of Egypt. For centuries, the north had exerted influence over this region, sending scribes, artisans, and priests who left traces of Egyptian culture in local towns. But time had changed the balance. Now, the south possessed a confidence that reached beyond its own borders. In the royal center at Napata, courtyards echoed with the calls of servants preparing morning rituals. Statues of gods revered for generations stood beneath clear skies, their features carved with a blend of Egyptian tradition and Kushite identity. The court moved with deliberate pace, guided by rulers who saw themselves not merely as heirs to local authority, but as protectors of a legacy more expansive than their homeland. They admired the grandeur of ancient Egypt, the monuments, the hieroglyphs, the ceremonial rites, and believed they understood the old ideals better than the Egyptians themselves now did. What set Kush apart was its cohesion. While Egypt fractured into competing dynasties and regional powers, the south embraced a unified identity. The royal family at Napata commanded loyalty across distant territories, supported by nobles who shared a common heritage and a sense of shared destiny. Their armies drilled with discipline. Their priests maintained rituals that blended local customs with borrowed Egyptian forms. And their kings cultivated a vision that stretched beyond their own borders, a belief that they were destined to restore order where Egypt could not. Travelers who passed between Elephantine and Napata saw the differences clearly. Egyptian frontier towns struggled with inconsistent leadership, shifting tax demands, and administrative confusion. Just beyond the cataract, however, settlements reflected an unusual harmony. Fields were well tended, fortresses freshly maintained, and officials coordinated their duties without hesitation. The people of Kush did not ignore the turmoil in Egypt. They watched it, studied it, and understood that the weakness of the north offered a rare opportunity. Among the rulers of Napata, one figure stood out, Paye, a king whose resolve shaped the course of both kingdoms. Calm in manner, yet unwavering in ambition, he viewed the world through the lens of divine mandate. His counselors recorded that he rose before dawn to listen to reports from across Kush's territories, weighing each with the patience of a man who believed his decisions would echo for generations. He saw Egypt not as a foreign land, but as a fractured version of the sacred order the gods intended. Its temples, especially those devoted to Amun, held traditions he respected deeply. Its people shared cultural foundations that linked their lands through centuries of exchange. To him, Egypt's decline required intervention, not conquest. Someone needed to restore balance. News from the north reached Napata regularly. Messengers described rival kings in the delta, priests ruling Upper Egypt with near-sovereign authority, and local warlords carving estates along the Nile. Paye listened to these accounts with measured intensity. Each report reinforced his belief that Egypt had drifted too far from its ancient path. Restoring it would require decisive action. Meanwhile, in the villages along the river, Kushite influence grew steadily. Merchants carried luxury goods, gold, incense, fine leather, that Egypt needed but could no longer acquire through internal stability. Local Egyptian leaders, seeking allies in uncertain times, welcomed these traders, often exchanging political favors for economic support. Priests in Upper Egypt maintained strong ties with their southern counterparts. Through these connections, the south built a network of relationships that crossed borders without raising alarms. As Paye's reputation spread, many Egyptians viewed him not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizing force. They admired his devotion to tradition, his respect for the gods, and his belief in sacred kingship. Some even sent quiet messages seeking his guidance, hoping he might mediate conflicts their own leaders failed to resolve. While the palace in the delta hesitated to acknowledge his growing influence, the people along the river understood that power was shifting. One year, tensions between rival delta factions escalated dangerously. Fighting broke out near key towns, disrupting trade and threatening temples. Word of this conflict reached Napata quickly. Paye considered the news gravely. He believed Egypt's disorder endangered the sacred world, a world both kingdoms shared. Restoring harmony demanded more than diplomacy. It required intervention grounded in spiritual duty. When he finally issued his command, it reflected both strategic calculation and religious devotion. He would march north, not as a foreign invader, but as a restorer. The preparations for this campaign unfolded with remarkable precision. Kushite soldiers assembled in disciplined formations, their shields polished, their spears straight, their commanders attentive to every detail. Priests blessed the regiments, invoking divine favor and reminding the troops that their mission aligned with sacred purpose. Supply caravans were organized with meticulous care, ensuring that the army could move steadily along the river without relying on the uncertain resources of Egyptian towns. As the campaign began, the people of Kush lined the roads, offering food, water, and prayers. They understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. Their king was leading them into the heart of a land long considered the center of civilization. Yet they did not fear. They believed the gods favored their cause. When Paye's forces crossed into Egyptian territory, they encountered regions eager for stability. Villagers welcomed the disciplined troops who paid for supplies. Rather than taking them, temple officials greeted Paye with ceremonial respect, acknowledging the shared devotion to Amun that linked their lands. In some nomes, local leaders opened their gates willingly, hoping that aligning with the Kushite king would bring relief from the endless disputes that plagued their lives. Not every region submitted peacefully. Certain delta rulers resisted fiercely, confident that their fortified towns and long-held authority could withstand a foreign advance. Yet PA approached these challenges with both strategy and patience. He chose his battles carefully, avoiding unnecessary destruction. When confrontation became inevitable, his troops moved swiftly, employing tactics refined through years of southern warfare. Victory followed consistently, not through overwhelming brutality, but through discipline and superior organization. As PA progressed northward, he documented the unfolding events with clarity. His victories were recorded not as celebrations of conquest, but as affirmations of divine order restored. For him, each captured town represented one more step toward unity, a unity Egypt's own leaders had failed to maintain. By the time he reached the heart of the Delta, resistance had weakened. Rival dynasties recognized that continuing to fight would only deepen the chaos. Many surrendered, acknowledging PA's authority as legitimate. And when he finally proclaimed the reunification of the two lands, those present understood that the accomplishment was not merely political, it was spiritual, cultural, and symbolic, an echo of earlier ages when Egypt had spoken with one voice. PA did not remain in Egypt after the campaign. He returned to Napata, leaving trusted officials to oversee the restored territories. His departure reflected confidence, not hesitation. The work of stabilizing the north had begun, and he believed his presence was no longer required to maintain it. For the first time in generations, the Nile Valley felt the weight of unity again. But even as the kingdom embraced this renewed order, forces from beyond the horizon would soon challenge everything Paye and his successors had achieved. Cool winds drifted along the Nile when word first reached Egypt that a distant empire had risen with an ambition unlike anything the region had seen before. Travelers from the Levant spoke in cautious tones of iron-willed kings, armies drilled to perfection, and cities that fell so quickly their defenders barely had time to understand who they were fighting. These stories carried the name of Assyria, a power whose reach extended from the mountains of the north to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Egypt had faced formidable enemies over the centuries. But this new force advanced with a momentum that unsettled even those accustomed to turmoil. In the years following Paye's successful unification, Egypt's leadership attempted to consolidate authority while maintaining its identity under the Kushite dynasty. The new rulers honored ancient rituals, restored temples, and projected an image of stability. For many Egyptians, this period offered relief. Roads became safer. Festivals regained their grandeur. Administrations settled into predictable patterns. Yet beneath the calm lay a growing recognition that Egypt's renewed unity had emerged in a world dominated by larger empires, whose ambitions extended far beyond their own borders. Signs of this shifting balance appeared gradually. Messengers returning from distant kingdoms reported that Assyria demanded tribute from cities once aligned with Egypt. Levantine rulers, who had previously sought Egyptian support, now hesitated to offend the rising empire. Coastal towns adjusted their allegiances, sending envoys eastward rather than south. Even merchants altered their routes, preferring to travel through Assyrian-protected zones rather than rely on Egypt's influence. Every such shift revealed the shrinking reach of Egyptian diplomacy. Within Egypt, the Kushite king Taharqa grappled with the reality of this changing world. He possessed the same devotion to tradition that defined Pige, and he approached governance with discipline and confidence. Cities under his authority experienced economic revival. Temples benefited from renewed patronage. Military garrisons received supplies and training that had been neglected during earlier centuries of division. Yet he also understood that Egypt now stood at a crossroads between ancient legacy and the rising shadow of foreign power. Assyrian expansion pressed closer with each passing year. While Egypt rebuilt itself through ritual and reform, its eastern neighbors fell one by one. The fortified cities of Judah struggled against overwhelming force. Coastal polities lost their autonomy. Even regions that had held out through earlier conflicts submitted reluctantly. And as these lands changed hands, Assyrian armies moved steadily toward territories that had historically belonged to Egypt's sphere of influence. Envoys arrived in Memphis, reporting that alliances Egypt once considered secure had weakened. Leaders who once looked to the Nile Valley for protection now pledged obedience to distant kings seated in Nineveh. Such shifts carried immense consequences. Egypt depended on these borderlands as buffers, zones that absorbed threats before they reached the delta. Losing them left Egypt exposed. In response, Taharqa strengthened defenses along vulnerable routes. Troops were stationed in key towns across the Levant, tasked with supporting local rulers who resisted Assyrian control. Supplies moved northward in steady caravans. Ships patrolled coastal passages. For a time, this strategy succeeded. Egypt's presence pushed back against Assyrian momentum, delaying the empire's advance and supporting allies determined to remain independent. But the pushback could not last indefinitely. The Assyrian kings, first Esarhaddon, then Ashurbanipal, viewed Egypt's influence as a challenge they intended to resolve. Their armies trained year-round, their siege engines leveled walls once thought impregnable, and their economic resources far exceeded what any neighboring kingdom could muster. Egypt might have held religious and cultural prestige, but prestige alone could not halt an empire driven by relentless ambition. The first major confrontation with Assyria struck like a sudden sandstorm. Armies clashed in the lands beyond the Sinai, where Egypt had maintained outposts since the earliest dynasties. Taharqa's forces fought with determination. Their archers displayed remarkable accuracy, and their chariotry cut through enemy ranks with practiced precision. Yet the Assyrian formations adapted quickly, absorbing each maneuver and responding with overwhelming force. The battle ended in retreat, not collapse, but the message was unmistakable. Egypt faced an adversary unlike any it had encountered in generations. Rumors spread quickly through the Nile Valley. Some believed Egypt would fall in a single campaign. Others insisted the gods would preserve the land, as they had done in earlier ages. The temples carried out rituals for protection, reciting hymns that invoked the power of Amun, Ra, and Mut. Smoke rose from countless altars. Yet even as the priests prayed, soldiers reinforced lands that had not seen concerted defense in decades. The next clash came with greater intensity. Esarhaddon marched south with a force so large that desert tribes fled before it, rather than risk confrontation. Town after town submitted to him. Egyptian garrisons resisted where they could, but Assyrian tactics overwhelmed their defenses. When the invaders reached Memphis, the battle raged through the streets. Houses burned, statues toppled, soldiers fought desperately to hold the bridges, but the city finally fell. The ruler of Egypt withdrew upriver to Thebes, vowing to continue resistance. Despite the setback, Egypt did not collapse. Taharqa retained support in Upper Egypt, where Kushite loyalty remained strong and the priesthood upheld tradition. From this base, he launched counterattacks, retaking some territory lost in the earlier campaign. His determination surprised the Assyrians, who had expected quick submission. For a brief moment, it seemed Egypt might defy the odds and reclaim its former influence. But Assyria responded with renewed force. Ashurbanipal dispatched a fresh army, larger, better equipped, and intent on ending Kushite rule once and for all. This time, the assault reached deep into Egypt. Cities along the Nile surrendered rather than face destruction. Local leaders, exhausted by years of conflict, accepted Assyrian rule in exchange for survival. And when soldiers from Kush retreated southward, the occupation spread through the delta without significant resistance. The final blow came when Thebes, long a sanctuary during Egypt's hardest struggles, faced the full might of Assyrian power. Envoys urged surrender. Thebes held out as long as it could, but the pressure was immense. Eventually, the Assyrians forced their way into the city. Temples were plundered, treasures seized, and the once proud southern capital left shaken. In the aftermath, the Kushite rulers withdrew fully to their homeland. Their dream of restoring Egyptian unity had not ended through failure of leadership, but through the overwhelming force of an empire whose reach extended farther than the Nile's ancient memory could grasp. Assyria installed local rulers in their stead, men chosen for loyalty rather than heritage. Egypt became a land governed through outsiders and intermediaries, its old order fractured beyond recognition. Though the Kushite dynasty retained pride and strength in their homeland, their chapter in Egypt's history closed under the weight of a world that had shifted irreversibly. Foreign powers now dictated Egypt's fate. And the two lands, once held together by ancient belief and tradition, entered an era where sovereignty depended on forces far beyond the desert's horizon. Morning sunlight glimmered across the western marshes of the delta when a remarkable shift began to unfold. Quiet at first, as most revivals do, rising not from triumphant declarations, but from the steady work of a man determined to restore order to a land exhausted by foreign rule. Egypt had endured the weight of Assyrian dominance, seen dynasties fall one after another, and watched its ancient rituals survive more by memory than by strength. Yet in this fragile moment, the emergence of a new leader offered hope that the two lands could once again stand under Egyptian authority. Along the northern frontier, whispered rumors began circulating. A prince of the Site line was gathering support, promising not chaos or revenge, but stability. His name, Psamtik, moved quietly through markets and barracks, carried by sailors and merchants who sensed something changing in the political winds. Unlike the great warrior kings of earlier centuries, he did not command vast armies or claim sweeping conquests. Instead, he built alliances with patience, spoke to regional leaders with respect, and sought loyalty, not through fear, but through shared necessity. Egypt, long deprived of unity, found these qualities compelling. In the town of Sais, once a modest center overshadowed by larger cities, his presence transformed the atmosphere. Soldiers stationed there trained rigorously, their discipline reminiscent of older dynasties. Artisans found themselves employed again, crafting fine ceramics and bronze fittings for administrative buildings being restored. Scribes copied legal texts, tax registers, and ritual documents that had fallen into disuse. The town expanded steadily, its streets filling with new workshops, storehouses, and court offices. Sais became more than a political base. It became the symbol of Egypt's slow rebirth. Across the delta, other leaders took notice. Governors tired of Assyrian interference sent cautious inquiries to the rising prince, testing whether he had the strength to challenge foreign-influenced local communities. Weary of paying tribute to distant kings, observed that his soldiers offered protection without extortion. Traders passing through Nile harbors carried stories of a man capable of balancing diplomacy and force, someone who seemed determined to restore Egypt's independence without plunging it into ruin. Bit by bit, Psamtik gathered the support that earlier contenders lacked. Meanwhile, the Assyrian Empire faced pressures of its own. Conflicts erupted in distant provinces, consuming resources and attention. Court intrigues in Nineveh weakened central authority. As their gaze shifted elsewhere, Egypt sensed an opening. Psamtik recognized it faster than anyone. He strengthened alliances with Greek mercenaries who had begun appearing in the Delta, seasoned warriors whose loyalty could be purchased with coin rather than bloodline. Their presence unsettled some in the Egyptian court, yet their discipline and reliability made them invaluable. Egypt had always adapted to survive, and in this moment, adaptation meant using foreign expertise to reclaim native sovereignty. Greeks were not the only newcomers shaping this revival. Traders from Asia Minor arrived in greater numbers, bringing exotic goods and unfamiliar customs. Instead of resisting these influences, Psamtik encouraged exchange. He believed Egypt could absorb new connections without losing its identity. Harbors near the Mediterranean flourished as ships stocked with wine, metals, olive oil, and pottery entered channels once choked by disorder. Egyptian produce, grain, linen, papyrus flowed outward again, linking the land to a world it had withdrawn from during decades of turmoil. While commerce revived, the temples experienced their own transformation. Psamtik understood that religious authority remained central to Egyptian identity, yet recent centuries had proven the danger of unchecked priestly power. Instead of suppressing the temples, he reorganized their administration. Priests continued performing their sacred duties, but the throne regained oversight of finances and regional influence. Such measures softened tensions between North and South, ensuring that the resurgence of royal authority did not ignite another fracture between Sais and Thebes. As unity grew, so did cultural renewal. Artists returned to older styles, recreating forms that echoed the glory of the new kingdom. Broad shoulders in reliefs, sharp lines in hieroglyphs, stately proportions in statues. Workshops in Memphis and Sais experimented with reviving techniques long unused, drawing inspiration from monuments that towered over the desert Egypt had endured centuries of foreign presence. Yet its artisans still carried ancestral memories. Their creations blended nostalgia with craftsmanship, turning cultural revival into tangible reality. Temples across the Nile Valley welcomed new construction. Columns rose again in courtyards once left to crumble. Sanctuaries were cleaned, repainted, and realigned with proper cosmic orientation. Rituals regained their rhythm, performed with the steadiness that had once defined Egyptian life. While the land remained wary of foreign empires, it carried an undeniable sense of renewal, a sense that the Nile had entered a second breath, a fragile yet genuine renaissance. Yet Psamtik's revival was not built on ceremony alone. He reformed administration with efficiency unseen in generations. Tax networks were re-established. Regional governors reported regularly to the central court. Military garrisons received standardized equipment. The river routes were cleared of bandits who had preyed on trade for decades. Even the scribal schools opened their doors to new students, training a generation capable of supporting the state's rebirth. This renewed order did not erase internal complexities, but it steadied them. Egypt was no longer a land defined by rival dynasties or fractured authority. It had begun to resemble the unified state it remembered being, a place where the symbols of kingship aligned once more with the workings of governance. Despite these successes, Psamtik understood that Egypt existed in a changed world. The great powers surrounding it did not vanish, simply because Egypt rediscovered its footing. The Greeks remained a constant presence in the Mediterranean. Libyan-descended nobles retained influence in some delta regions, and far to the east, a new empire, one more organized and determined than Assyria, was rising with unmistakable momentum. Diplomacy could delay conflict, but Egypt's future depended on navigating this shifting world carefully. For now, the land embraced its revival. Farmers harvested stable yields again. Markets thrived. Caravans flowed between regions that had once turned their backs on each other. And in Suez, the court stood confident that Egypt had reclaimed something precious, the ability to shape its own destiny. But the peace felt delicate, almost provisional. Leaders along the Nile sensed that new storms gathered beyond the horizon. The empire forming in Persia would soon test every accomplishment of this sate renaissance. And the question looming over Egypt was no longer whether the land could recover, but whether its recovery could withstand the ambitions of a world far larger than the one it had rebuilt. Even as Suez flourished under new confidence, faint tremors of unease traveled through the delta's harbors and across the inland roads. Traders arriving from the eastern Mediterranean brought news wrapped in caution. A new empire was rising beyond the deserts, vast in ambition and steady in its advance. Few Egyptians understood the full scale of what was taking shape in the lands once ruled by the great kings of Mesopotamia, but those who traveled furthest recognized the shift at once. The balance of power in the Near East had changed, and the new force claimed its authority with sweeping certainty. Caravans spoke of a ruler who had conquered Babylon with astonishing speed, a man whose armies moved with quiet discipline and whose administrators reorganized territories as if redrawing a map were a simple matter of will. The name Cyrus passed from merchant to merchant, murmured with respect even among those who had never seen his banners. He treated conquered lands not as trophies, but as components of a vast order he intended to maintain. For a world accustomed to warlords and short-lived dominions, such stability felt unfamiliar and dangerously effective. Egypt listened, but cautiously. The site revival under Psamtik and his successors had restored pride, yet memories of Assyrian invasion remained sharp. The kingdom understood the fragility of recovering strength. While Egypt rebuilt its temples and revived its networks, Persia expanded across plains, mountains, and cities with only modest resistance. The lands that once served as Egypt's eastern buffer, Lydia, Babylon, and the smaller kingdoms scattered throughout the Levant, now shifted beneath Persian command. In coastal towns of the Delta, sailors felt the change before any decree reached Suez. Ships arriving from Phoenician ports carried different markings, and their captains spoke of a single authority controlling harbors from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean tribute. Taxes and military obligations were reorganized with astonishing efficiency. The Persian kings expected loyalty from those they governed, and those who complied found the empire firm but predictable. This predictable strength unsettled Egypt far more than the chaotic conquests of earlier empires. At the Saite court, the ruler faced an impossible question. How does one prepare for an enemy that has not yet attacked, yet advances steadily toward your borders with every passing season? Diplomacy offered one approach. Envoys traveled to Greek city-states, seeking alliances that might deter Persian ambition. These cities respected Egypt's heritage and valued its grain, but their own rivalries weakened commitments. Some agreed to send aid. Others hesitated. and a few preferred to negotiate with Persia directly, hoping to secure favor in the new political order. Libyan chieftains near the western frontier were approached as well. Their loyalty varied. Some aligned themselves firmly with Egypt, while others balanced their allegiance between size and whichever external power promised stability. Egypt's diplomats negotiated tirelessly, trying to fortify every direction at once. Yet the scope of the Persian Empire made every alliance feel small by comparison. Meanwhile, the Persians continued their march. Their armies moved methodically, crossing rivers with engineered bridges and advancing across deserts with caravans prepared for long campaigns. Their archers, infantry, and cavalry worked in synchronization unfamiliar to Egypt's soldiers. Even before direct conflict began, Egypt could sense that the empire approaching its borders was structured differently from any adversary it had faced in earlier centuries. Not far from Sais, garrisons trained to match this rising threat. Greek mercenaries drilled alongside Egyptian forces, their distinct armor and tactics blending gradually with local formations. Coastal watchtowers were repaired. Fortifications near Pelusium strengthened their walls. The delta's labyrinth of canals and marshes, natural barriers that had protected Egypt from countless invaders, offered confidence. Yet the generals understood that confidence alone could not repel what loomed beyond the Sinai. Across the Nile Valley, ordinary people felt the tension, even if they did not know its source. Taxes rose modestly. Conscription expanded. Caravans moved with greater caution. Some feared a return to the chaos of earlier centuries. Others trusted the site rulers to maintain the revival they had worked so hard to build. But beneath all daily concerns lay the same question, whispered in markets and temple courtyards alike. Would Persia stop at the Levant, or would it follow the path every great empire eventually took, southward toward the two lands? The answer arrived slowly, unmistakably. Cyrus's successors continued his policies with unwavering resolve. Babylon had fallen. Lydia had fallen. Regions that once resisted with fierce independence now accepted Persian governance. When word reached Egypt that Cambyses, the successor to Cyrus, had turned his attention westward, no room remained for illusions. Egypt was next. Preparations intensified. Engineers surveyed the delta's terrain, planning defensive positions along the canopied branches of the Nile. Naval units expanded patrols along the Mediterranean coastline. Priests performed rites for protection, invoking Ma'at to steady the land against approaching chaos. The temples and the court, so often divided, now shared a common aim: preserving the last native dynasty. Despite the growing alarm, life continued with surprising normalcy. Farmers planted and harvested. Artisans carved stone reliefs, celebrating the Saïta restoration. Children played in the narrow alleys of Sais, unaware that a foreign king had already begun assembling an invasion force on the eastern frontier. This persistence of everyday life gave Egypt strength, yet it also created an illusion that danger remained distant. When Persian troops finally advanced toward the Sinai, the first reports described a force unlike any Egypt had faced. Their soldiers moved without hesitation, advancing across terrain that had broken earlier invaders. Supply lines followed with meticulous organization. The Egyptian commanders believed the delta's marshes would slow them, but the Persians adapted quickly, turning obstacles into manageable challenges rather than insurmountable barriers. The decisive encounter came at Pelusium, where Egyptian forces held a fortified position, guarding the most direct route into the delta. The battle raged along muddy ground, beneath a sky heavy with dust. Egyptians fought with determination. Greek allies matched their discipline. Yet the Persian formations pressed forward with relentless cohesion, gradually bending the defensive lines. Confusion rippled through the ranks when messages from commanders failed to reach distant regiments in time. The marsh terrain, usually Egypt's ally, muddled communication and trapped retreating units. By sunset, the field belonged to Persia. In the aftermath, Egypt's position collapsed rapidly. Towns surrendered to avoid destruction. Fortresses opened their gates when they saw Persian standards approaching Cambyses, entered Memphis soon after, claiming control with ceremonial calm rather than violence. Local elites who resisted were replaced with administrators loyal to the empire. Those who cooperated found themselves absorbed into a structure far larger than they had ever imagined. With this conquest, the ancient order broke completely. For the first time, Egypt did not merely fall under foreign influence. It became a fully integrated province within an imperial system kingship. Once the heartbeat of Egyptian identity ceded its authority to a distant ruler seated in Persia. The Saite revival had restored beauty and structure, but it could not withstand the weight of a world transformed. Persia's power stretched beyond anything Egypt could match, and the long arc of pharaonic rule bent at last beneath its pressure. The land had entered a new age, one in which the symbols of its ancient sovereignty survived only in memory and in the sunlit stone of its enduring monuments. Dawn light spilled across the eastern horizon when the first rumors of revolt drifted into the delta. Fishermen along the shallow inlets whispered that Persian envoys had been attacked on the road to Memphis caravan guides, reported seeing smoke rising from villages that had refused to pay tribute. And in market stalls, where traders from every corner of the region converged, cautious conversations revealed that Egypt, long resigned to foreign rule, was stirring again. The people had not forgotten their traditions, nor the memory of kings who had once governed from the heart of the Nile Valley. Something deep and unresolved pressed upward through the land, seeking release. In the decades following the Persian conquest, Egypt endured a structure that felt alien to its centuries-old rhythms. Satraps governed the provinces with efficient authority, but their priorities belonged to distant capitals. Taxes flowed outward rather than inward. Decisions affecting local life traveled through administrators, who measured loyalty in terms foreign to the Nile's ancient customs. Temples continued their rituals, but the sacred bond between throne and sanctuary had been severed. For a civilization that defined itself through that bond, the wound ran deep. Even so, daily life did not collapse. Farmers plowed their fields, drawing steady crops from the fertile soil. Artisans carved reliefs with practiced hands. Merchants navigated the familiar bends of the river. Egypt had always learned to absorb the presence of outsiders. Hyksos, Libyans, Assyrians, Kushites, and adapt without losing itself. Yet the Persian occupation differed in one essential way. It replaced the very institution that anchored Egyptian identity. Without a native ruler sitting on the throne, the land moved through its seasons with a subtle ache, a sense that Ma'at, the world's rightful balance, had been unsettled. As dissatisfaction grew quietly, the first sparks of rebellion came from the northern nomes. Local leaders, emboldened by moments of Persian distraction, called meetings in hidden chambers. They gathered scribes, soldiers, and temple representatives willing to risk their safety for the chance to reclaim autonomy. Their motivations varied. Some desired political freedom. Others feared that Persian policies threatened sacred traditions. A few simply longed for Egyptian leadership as a matter of pride. Whatever their reasons, they found common cause in the belief that foreign rule, however efficient, could not define Egypt's destiny. When the uprising finally erupted, it did so with surprising coordination. Messengers carried signals through the delta's winding waterways. Guards posted along canals defected without resistance. Persian garrisons in certain districts awoke to find entire towns refusing to obey their orders. And in a bold declaration that spread like wildfire, a local noble named Emertius proclaimed himself ruler of a restored Egyptian kingdom. His claim was audacious, yet it resonated instantly. People flocked to his banner, eager to support a native leader who promised to restore sovereignty. The revolt expanded swiftly. Persian administrators withdrew to fortified centers, uncertain which nomes remained loyal. Envoys sent to reassert authority were turned away at river checkpoints. Even among Egyptian officials who had served the empire faithfully, hesitation spread. The possibility of self-rule, long dormant, reawakened their sense of identity. And as momentum built, the rebels gained control of key channels, effectively cutting off communication between Persian outposts. Meanwhile, Amyrtaeus moved through his territories with measured confidence. He visited temples to offer gestures of devotion that reassured priests of his respect for sacred traditions. He secured alliances with influential families, whose support proved essential for political stability. He reorganized local militias, transforming scattered fighters into a force capable of defending Egypt, should Persia attempt to retake the land. For a brief moment, Egypt tasted independence again. Crowds celebrated in Sais and Memphis, thrilled by the idea that the ancient kingdom could still raise its head after centuries of turmoil. But this resurgence rested on fragile ground. Persia remained a massive empire, able to mobilize armies larger than anything Egypt could field. Its rulers viewed the revolt not as a challenge to negotiate, but as an annoyance to suppress. Amyrtaeus understood the danger, and his strategy focused not on confrontation, but on positioning. He sought allies among Greek city-states, hoping that their own rivalries with Persia would encourage support. Some Greek mercenaries joined his cause. Others hesitated, wary of provoking a power that dominated their trade routes. In Upper Egypt, the response to the revolt unfolded differently. The priesthood of Amun had weathered earlier transitions by adapting to each new political order. They were cautious, refusing to commit prematurely. They welcomed emissaries from the Delta, but avoided declarations that might provoke Persian retaliation. Over time, however, their stance softened. Rituals honoring Egyptian kingship began reappearing with subdued symbolism, and temple leaders sent cautious messages indicating a willingness to recognize Amyrtaeus if his position remained secure. The tide shifted momentarily in Egypt's favor when internal conflicts distracted Persia. Revolts erupted in distant provinces. Rival claimants to the Persian throne created distractions that pulled armies eastward. Egypt, always quick to read the currents of opportunity, pressed its advantage. Amyrtaeus consolidated control, forming the 28th dynasty, a short-lived but symbolically potent line that proved Egypt's identity could still revive, even after devastating conquest. After Amyrtaeus's death, instability returned. New leaders emerged with ambitions to claim the throne, each tied to different networks of support. This turbulence, however, did not weaken Egypt's aspirations. Instead, it created a unique period when multiple dynasties, 29th and 30th, rose in quick succession, each determined to preserve native rule. Their reigns were marked by strategic diplomacy, temple reforms, and military campaigns designed to keep Persia at bay. One ruler in particular, Nectanebo I, stood out among them. His ascent brought renewed confidence. He strengthened defenses along the frontier, rebuilt fortresses, and restored key temples in both Upper and Lower Egypt. His policies created a surprising resurgence of unity. People spoke of Egypt as though the ancient glory had returned, not in full, but in spirit. And for a brief span, it seemed that native kings might maintain the independence won during Amyrtaeus' revolt. When Nectanebo II inherited the throne, he carried that legacy forward with determination. He forged alliances with Greek powers, supported temple life with generous patronage, and monitored Persian movements with strategic caution. Egypt under his rule felt alert, vigilant, and proud. The people honored him as a king who understood the fragile balance of the era and upheld the duty of protecting the two lands. Yet the threat beyond the eastern horizon grew heavier with each passing season. Persia recovered from internal strife and resumed its expansion. It reorganized armies, stabilized the throne, and identified Egypt as a province that needed to be reclaimed. Envoys traveling through the Levant carried warnings. Greek allies offered assistance, but their internal disputes often delayed meaningful support. Nectanebo sensed the shift immediately. Every decision he made reflected the awareness that Egypt's independence hung by a thread. Still, the people stood behind him. They repaired canals, shipped grain to fortresses, trained with local commanders, and prepared for a conflict many hoped would never come. Egyptians had witnessed centuries of invasion and restoration, loss and recovery. They knew the stakes. They also understood that if Persia returned with full force, the struggle might decide not only the fate of a dynasty, but the survival of native rule itself. For the moment, however, the land lived under the renewed strength of its last native kings. Independence, though fragile, pulsed through the Nile Valley once more. An echo of ancient sovereignty, rising for the final time before the shadow of empire returned. Evening shadows stretched across the courtyards of Sais when the first reports arrived. Persian troops had crossed the eastern frontier again. This time, there were no distractions in distant provinces, no rival claimants weakening the empire's resolve. The renewed campaign moved with calm precision, led by generals determined to restore what their predecessors had briefly lost. Egypt had prepared as best it could, fortifying the delta and rallying allies, yet everyone sensed that the coming struggle would be decisive. The last native dynasty stood alone against a force whose ambitions spanned continents. In the royal residence, Nectanebo II read the dispatches in silence. Courtiers watched him carefully, uncertain whether his measured expression meant confidence or dread. He had ruled with steady determination, defending Egypt's independence longer than many expected. But now, as the news unfolded, even his closest advisors understood the magnitude of what they faced. Persian armies were larger, better supplied, and strategically unified. Their advance was not a raid or a punitive action. It was a deliberate reclamation of a province they considered rightfully theirs. Along the northern canals, soldiers tightened leather straps on their shields and prepared for a confrontation they knew might stretch beyond the delta's narrow passages. Greek mercenaries stationed near Pelusium examined their armor, sharpening blades dulled by months of drills. Local militias gathered in clusters, awaiting orders that would determine whether they held the river's edge or fell back to protect inland towns. The marshlands filled with the low hum of anticipation, the same uneasy quiet that marks the moments before a storm breaks. At the same time, envoys traveled between Egypt and its Greek allies, pleading for reinforcements. Some city-states responded with sincerity. Others hesitated, weighed down by their own conflicts. A few offered symbolic support, but no troops. Nectanebo understood the reality. Egypt could not depend on foreign assistance. Whatever happened next would be decided by the soldiers standing along the delta, the commanders who knew every inlet and waterway, and the resolve of a people who had reclaimed their independence only to face the threat of losing it again. Persian forces entered the Sinai with deliberate care, securing water sources, laying supply routes, and avoiding the mistakes of earlier expeditions. Their cavalry moved ahead to scout the terrain, while infantry advanced behind them in tight formations. Siege equipment followed on carts, pulled by oxen across the desert plains. No detail was left to chance. The empire intended not only to conquer Egypt, but to ensure that resistance would not rise again. When the first clash erupted near Pelusium, the earth shook beneath hundreds of marching feet. Arrows filled the air, scattering against shields on both sides. Egyptian regiments held the line with determination, wielding spears and bows honed through constant training. Their Greek counterparts pressed forward in dense formations, pushing against the Persian advance with practiced discipline. For hours, neither side gained ground. Dust rose around the combatants, blanketing the battlefield in a haze that made friend and foe difficult to distinguish. But gradually, the pressure increased. Persian reserves flowed seamlessly into the fray, reinforcing positions that wavered and breaking through stretches where Egyptian soldiers had grown thin. Their commanders used the terrain with calculated precision, maneuvering around marshes that disrupted the defenders' communication. And when a well-timed flanking maneuver struck from the south, Egypt's left wing faltered. Retreat became necessary, not as a collapse, but as a painful recognition that the position could not be held. News of the setback traveled quickly upriver. In Memphis, residents prepared for the possibility that the city might fall. Temples stored sacred artifacts in hidden chambers. Families gathered possessions they could carry. Even the priests, who had witnessed countless invasions across centuries, moved with urgency, aware of how closely history repeated itself. Yet amid these preparations, a sense of collective strength lingered. The people refused panic. They had weathered invaders before. They would brace themselves again. Nectanebo retreated to Upper Egypt, where loyalty ran deepest and where the river narrowed, offering natural defenses. He consulted generals, priests, and local leaders, seeking strategies that might buy time or provide openings for counterattack. But every option led back to the same obstacle. Persia's strength was overwhelming. The empire moved with unity, while Egypt stood isolated. Allies who might once have intervened were entangled in their own battles. And the land's spirit, though unbroken, could not compensate for the lack of resources needed to sustain prolonged resistance. As Persian forces captured Memphis and advanced southward, the final decision approached. The ruler faced the same painful choice many before him had confronted: fight to the last city and risk the destruction of everything he swore to protect, or withdraw to preserve what remained of his people. Ultimately, he chose survival. Egypt's legacy mattered too much to sacrifice for a futile stand. With a small escort, he journeyed south toward Nubia, leaving the throne behind, a throne that, for the first time, passed from native hands not through internal struggle, but through the sheer weight of a foreign empire. Persian control settled over the Nile Valley, with the same structured efficiency it displayed elsewhere. Administrators inspected granaries, organized labor, and re-established trade routes disrupted by the war. Local officials who pledged loyalty kept their positions. Temples resumed rituals, now under the watchful gaze of imperial representatives. Life continued, not as it once had, but without the chaos people had feared. Yet beneath this veneer of order, something profound had changed. The line of pharaohs, stretching across more than 3 millennia, had ended. The symbolism struck the land with quiet force. Egyptians had seen foreign rulers before, but never had the sacred institution of kingship been replaced entirely. The divine order that bound heavens, earth, and monarchy dissolved into history. The crown no longer represented a living lineage, but an echo of a world that had shaped civilizations across continents. The temples carried on the rituals, the people carried on their customs. But the meaning behind those traditions shifted, becoming memories rather than sources of authority. Along the riverbanks, elders spoke softly of the old days when Egypt commanded its destiny. Younger generations listened with reverence, recognizing that they belonged to a legacy both enduring and irrevocably changed. The monuments remained, stone giants casting long shadows over fields and villages. The language endured in temples and administrative halls. The culture persisted in songs, festivals, and daily rituals. But the pharaonic world had closed. The land entered a new age, not by its own choosing, but by the weight of external power and the tides of history that had swept across the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries. Yet Egypt did not vanish. It adapted, as it always had, carrying its identity forward, even when sovereignty slipped away. And though foreign rulers would claim the throne for generations to come, the memory of the pharaohs, their grandeur, their endurance, and their long reign over the two lands remained an unbroken presence in the hearts of the people, preserved like the monuments that still watched over the river's eternal flow.